Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The naval hub of the West, home of the United States Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor Naval Station brutally was awoken to an attack unlike any other. Hi, I'm Tyler. This is Ivy, Nicole, and Ryan. Today, we are going to talk about something in United States history that will never be forgotten, and those are the attacks on Pearl Harbor. The timing and targeting of the attacks on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Navy destroyed an enormous amount of naval equipment, while taking the lives of far too many. These had long-lasting effects on the families of the fallen and United States citizens alike. What angered the Japanese to the point that they wanted to do these brutal attacks on the United States? This is a question that I'm going to pertain to first. First off, Franklin Roosevelt was the current president at the time, and he moved the United States Pacific Fleet of the Navy from San Diego, California to Hawaii in 1940. These actions were made to discourage the path of destruction Japan was doing on that southeast coast of Asia. This movement to Hawaii was not necessarily an act of threat or an act of destruction on Japan. It was more of a safety net or an insurance policy that the United States wanted to take in order to secure their position in that coast if anything happened to escalate in the Pacific Ocean or with Japan alike. That leads me right into my next point. Japan continued with that path of destruction. Through numerous failed negotiation attempts that we had with Japan to try to stop this destruction, the United States decided to seize all oil that we were sending to Japan. With the combination of having the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, and also with the failed negotiations adding on top that we decided to seize all oil to Japan, this caused rocky feelings among the Japanese government, which ultimately led to that day we will never forget. Overall, the United States Pacific Fleet of the Navy was moved to Hawaii in 1940 by FDR. The proximity that it had towards Japan proved to be one of those deciding factors that caused Japan to ultimately attack our base. These actions that they made on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, will be something that we'll never forget. Now let me send it over to Ivy, who will talk about what actually happened that morning of this most dreadful day.
Thanks, Tyler. The attack on Pearl Harbor began at 7:55 in the morning and lasted about an hour and 15 minutes. The entire event was over by 9:45 in the morning, and most of the damage was done within 30 minutes of the attacks. The first Japanese dive bomber was part of a wave of nearly 200 aircraft, including torpedo planes, bombers, and fighters. The first wave consisted of 183 planes and was launched just north of Oahu. 6 of these planes failed to launch. Sounds of alarms, exploding bombs, and gunfire alarmed the men aboard the U.S. ships, prompting them to dress and report to general quarter stations immediately. The second attack wave happened about 45 minutes later. It consisted of 171 planes, 4 of which failed to launch. The second wave was divided into 3 groups. One was directed to attack Kaneohe, and the rest Pearl Harbor. The separate sections arrived at the attack point around the same time from different directions. All 8 of the ships were either sunk or damaged. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor with absolutely no warning at all. They completely surprised the entire United States. First of all, Japan and Hawaii were over 4,000 miles apart. Surely Japan would attack somewhere closer to them, such as a local European colony or Singapore or Indochina, not Hawaii. Although the first attack was detected by a private U.S. Army private, he was told to ignore this because a flight of planes from the U.S. were already expected during this time. The naval facilities at Pearl Harbor were completely undefended and were not prepared for this attack. The Japanese just knew that the U.S. would not be fully manned. They knew Americans would be relaxed and unaware, not expecting an attack on a Sunday morning. This is why Pearl Harbor was such an alluring target to the U.S. Now that I've told you a little bit about the attacks, I'll turn it over to Nicole to tell you all about the soldiers and ships that were lost during this attack.
Thank you, Ivy. As she previously talked about, the attack at Pearl Harbor was devastating for both our military and our country. I believe Winston Churchill said it best when he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." We lost a lot of good men on this morning for a war that we weren't even a part of yet. As Ivy previously stated, there was no declaration of war from Japan. It was not received in Washington until after the first attack had already happened. Since this was a surprise attack for our U.S. military, we were unprepared and unable to defend our fleet. This resulted in the deaths of 2,400 men and the additional injuries of 1,100. And while the attacks affected mostly our military, we also lost 68 civilians that morning. That doesn't even include the 20 ships we lost to their airstrike, eight of which were battleships, which they took as a consolation prize because they wanted our aircraft carriers, the 3 of which were out to sea already. We also lost 300 aircraft, which made it difficult to pursue a counterattack. The most devastating loss was the USS Arizona, which housed most of our men that died in the Pearl Harbor attacks. It was struck 4 separate times by Japanese aircraft, and we lost 23 sets of brothers aboard it. The attack at Pearl Harbor was the largest attack on U.S. soil to date until September 11, 2001, and it has left a lasting impression on our country and on Americans. I'm going to hand this over to Ryan. She will let you know what happened after the attack.
Thank you, Nicole. December 7th, 1941 is a day Americans will never forget. On that day, thousands of Americans lost their lives, and it catapulted America into a war we had adamantly tried to stay out of. In the aftermath of this tragedy, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would draft and deliver an iconic speech to Congress, as well as sign a declaration of war against Japan the following day. As Americans, both past and future generations, it is imperative that we continue to honor the immense sacrifice of those brave men and women through history, survivor stories, and the memorial. Now that we've established the events that occurred on that tragic day, let us now take a look at what happened in the aftermath. Upon learning of the attacks in Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt drafted a speech which he would give to Congress. This speech would then become iconic, as he would declare that this day would live in infamy. The following day, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt would also sign a declaration of war against Japan, and these actions would also lead to the entrance of America into World War II. Although the loss of life that day was great, and in the days and years to come in the war, President Roosevelt wanted to memorialize the lives of those lost so that their sacrifice would not go unforgotten. In 1958, President Roosevelt would sign into legislation the creation of a memorial over the USS Arizona. The memorial would sit atop of the ship, which still sits at the bottom of the harbor, and would have a wall that would list all of the names of those we lost so tragically on that day. Furthermore, the memory lives on through survivors by the stories they pass on through generations. My grandfather was a cook on one of the ships in Pearl Harbor, and he passed on an heirloom to me, his dog tags. Another way we honor those men that died that day is every year on December 7th, it is Pearl Harbor Day. This day, Americans take time to reflect and honor those who died that day. Another way we honor their memory is by allowing survivors of the USS Arizona to be interred in the ship upon death. They are cremated, and then their urn is carried down by divers so they can rest in peace with their lost shipmates finally. In conclusion, Pearl Harbor was the United States naval hub of the West for its prime location and its proximity to islands in the Pacific. Though the base flourished as a naval epicenter for America, no one could have predicted the tragedies that would unfold on December 7, 1941. On that day, thousands sacrificed everything for this country when Japan launched a surprise attack on the harbor, claiming the lives of 2,400 men and countless ships. Today, the hull of the USS Arizona still sits at the bottom of the harbor underneath Memorial Bridge and serves as a tangible reminder of the tragic events that unfolded that day. Drops of oil can still be seen floating to the surface as if they are tears from the USS Arizona mourning the loss of all those lives and that day and in the days to come in World War II. We may not remember the names of all the survivors or those who perished that day, but we must remember and honor their sacrifice through history, the memorial, and every year on December 7th. On behalf of myself, Tyler, Ivy, and Nicole, thank you.